there! I'm back! And today we have another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile. If you're new here, welcome to my channel. If you're not new here, thank you for returning. As often as I can, I do a series called Beauty and the Bibliophile where I do my makeup and I tell you about the latest book that I've read. If you don't know what a bibliophile is, don't worry, I'll tell you. It is a lover and a collector of books. That's me. I know it's been a minute since I've uploaded. I've got a lot of new things kind of going on in my life, which has taken a little bit of time away from this, but I'm trying to work out my time management so that I can continue to do these and do the new things going on in my life. I think I might do like a get ready with me life update video shortly here to explain all that, if you're even interested. Anyway, today we're doing one, finally, and today we are doing, I forgot the actual book, but that's okay because it's not an actual book. It's a story from a collection of stories by Hans Christian Andersen, and today we're doing The Snow Queen. Now, spoiler alerts, if you are thinking about reading this and you don't want to know anything about it, do not watch this video. If you don't want to read the book or the story, but you want to know what happens in it, then this is an excellent video for you. Now, supposedly, this story, The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen, that came out in 1844, is what inspired the movie Frozen by Disney. I don't see it. In the opening credits, it does say inspired by the Hans Christian Andersen story, The Snow Queen. But when you watch that movie and then you read this book, there are no similarities besides the snow. Unlike a lot of the other Disney movies that are inspired by these classic fairy tales, you can get it. You can see, yeah, it's not exactly the same, but you can see where they've drawn inspiration from the original. Not in this one. So, I don't know. Let me know what you think about that. Anyways, so, if you want to hear the story, the original story of the Snow Queen, and see how I did this look, and stay tuned. If you're curious about any of the products that I'm using, they will be listed in the description box below. Alright, so The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen, and this story came out in 1844. Now, once upon a time, there was a wicked hobgoblin, a real demon. And one day, he was very happy because he had invented a mirror that whatever was reflected in it would become distorted. Everything that was good and wonderful would shrink away to nothing. And everything that was bad and good for nothing would be amplified in the mirror. So like the most beautiful landscapes reflected in it would look like boiled spinach. And every beautiful person became hideous looking beyond recognition. And if they had even one little flaw, like a little freckle or something, it would spread all over their face. Now, this demon thought this was just so amusing, and so did all his demon friends. And they would go all over the world with it, reflecting everybody that they could find. And they were very happy about this because finally they would be able to see through the mirror, you know, how the world and people really were. Okay, I'm gonna let my skincare sit for a few minutes before we move on to makeup. So anyway, all these demons, they were so thrilled with this mirror, and they had a thought, oh my gosh, what if we took this mirror up to heaven so we could mock the angels with it? Wouldn't that be fun? So they all are like holding on to it and flying up to heaven. But the higher they got, the harder it was for them to hold on to the mirror. And it slipped out of their hands and fell to earth. and shattered into 1 billion pieces. And then it did even more harm. Now, some of these pieces were no bigger than a grain of sand, and some of them got into people's eyes and got stuck there, and it would distort everything that they saw. Everything they looked at now looked amiss and ugly. What was even worse is that these tiny grains of mirror held the same power that the whole mirror had. And some of these bits of glass went into people's hearts, and this was really terrible because over time it would turn their hearts into a lump of ice. Now, the demon that had invented this mirror, he was ecstatic. He laughed at all the mischief that he had created. He thought it was great. And some of these fragments of mirror are still floating around the earth to this day. And this is the story of what happened to a couple of those pieces. Now, in a big town, crowded, full of houses and people, were 2 children, a little boy and a little girl. The little boy was Kay and the little girl is Gerda. And they weren't brother and sister, they were just playmates. They lived next door to each other, but they loved each other as if they were brother and sister. And there was a rose tree in between both of their houses, and they would spend a lot of time under this rose tree playing games and looking at books together. Now, in the winter, the kids would have to play inside together, and a lot of the times one of their grandmothers, I can't remember which kid's grandmother, but she would babysit them a lot. And they would look out the window at the snow drifts, so like the snowflakes like flying around, and the grandmother would say, "Oh, look, it's the white bees." And Kay was like, "Oh, bees?" He was like, "Do they have a queen, like real bees?" And the grandmother's like, "Yes, they do. She flies where the swarm is the thickest. She's the biggest one of all. And sometimes at night during the winter, she flies through the streets and she peeks into the windows of people's houses, and that is how they get the frozen ice patterns on the window panes." Now, the little girl got a little frightened by this story for some reason. She was like, "Oh, the queen, she can't get in here, can she?" And Kay is like, "Don't worry about her. If she comes in here, I'm gonna put her on the stove to melt." And this made the grandmother laugh, and so she moved on to, other stories since the little girl was getting a little frightened. Now, that evening, when Gerda had gone home and Kay was at home, he pushed a chair up to the window and looked out into the snowy street. Snowflakes were falling very heavy, and one snowflake landed on the window box, but it started getting bigger and bigger, and it grew into a beautiful woman who was all glittery and made of ice. And she sees Kay and she gives him a little wave like that, and it kind of scared him and he jumped back from the window. But one thing he had noticed about this beautiful woman, there seemed to be no peace or rest in her eyes. I think today I'm gonna do like a light coverage. It's hot today and we're going out later and I don't want a bunch of thick makeup on. Now, the next day you could tell that spring was coming, and the 2 children were outside playing near the rose trees. And the roses reminded the little girl of a hymn that she had just learned, and she sung it for the little boy. And it was, "Where the roses deck the flowery vale, there, infant Jesus, thee we hail." I don't know a ton about Hans Christian Andersen and his life or beliefs, but from his stories, it seems to be he is a man of the Christian faith very much, and he works it into his stories. Now, one day in the later summer, the 2 children were sitting under the rose trees looking at a picture book. And all of a sudden, Kay goes, "Oh, I felt something like hit my heart." and there's something in my eye. And he blinked a bunch, but nothing was there. And he's like, oh, you know what? I think it's gone. But it wasn't gone. It was one of those grains of glass from that magic mirror. You remember the mirror from The Demon? That horrid mirror where all the good and great things reflected in it become small and mean. While all the bad things were magnified and every flaw became very apparent. Now, poor Kay, a grain of it had gone straight into his heart. Even though he couldn't feel it anymore, it was still there. His heart would soon start to turn into a lump of ice. Now, there was something different about Kay from that moment on. And he looks at Gerda and he's like, ugh. He's like, you look ugly. He's like, look at these roses. There's worms in them and they're crooked. He's like, roses are nasty. And he like kicks the box that the roses are in. And Gerda's like, what are you doing? Why are you acting like this? And when Kay sees Gerda's like reaction to his behavior, he just goes running off. Now the next time that Gerda saw Kay, she had her picture book with her and she wanted Kay to go and sit under the tree with her and look at it. But he was like, picture books are for babies. Kay had definitely become a bit of a troublesome little boy. Whenever his grandmother wanted to tell them stories, he would like stand behind her and mock her and imitate her. And he actually would like do this with everybody in town. And he was pretty good at imitating everyone and pointing out all their peculiarities and failings. And it was all because of this grain of glass that was in his eye and in his heart. And it made him tease little Gerda, who had always been such a good friend to him. He wanted to play different games now. He seemed like he had gotten older or something. And when winter came around again, one day, he had his magnifying glass with him. And he was watching the snow fall onto his dark blue jacket. And he saw Gerda, and he had her look through the magnifying glass at the snowflakes. And he's like, see how like perfectly made they are? Not one flaw, like stars or something. He's like, they're so much better than flowers that have, you know, imperfections. He's like, I wished that they didn't melt. And then he ran off to go play with some of the more older and rowdy boys in the town square. Now, in the square, these kind of troublesome little boys would take their sleds and they would tie them up to the farm carts when they came through town and would ride on their sleds behind them. They'd tie them up and let the farm cart drag them. Now suddenly a very large sled came into the square and was painted all white, and the driver had on a white fur coat and cap. And Kay decided to quickly tie his little sled up to the back of this larger sled. Now the big sled pulled away to go out of the town and was going faster and faster. And the driver turned around and saw Kay and gave him a friendly little nod, almost like they knew each other or something. Now Kay thought that, you know, it was going faster and faster, and he was like, you know, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. And he went to untie his sled from the larger sled. But when he did, the driver would turn around and look at him, give a little nod, and for some reason it kind of like made Kay kind of freeze, like he shouldn't do it. So Kay just stayed where he was until they drove out of town. Now the snow began to fall faster and heavier, and he could barely see his hand in front of his face. And again, he's thinking, you know, I really need to get off of this sled. And he goes to untie it again and get away, but it was no use because every time he did, the driver would turn around and give him a look like, don't you dare. He even like shouted out for help, but there was nobody around to hear him. And every now and again, the sled would like fly up into the air, kind of like they were like going over ditches or something, or like jumping over hedges. And this frightened him, and he was like, oh, I need to say my prayers. But for some reason, he could only remember his times tables. Now finally, the sled stopped, and the driver got out and looked at him, and it was a tall, shining white lady, the Snow Queen herself. She was like, it's cold enough to kill a person out here. She's like, come here. She's like, creep inside of my coat to keep warm. So she lifted Kay up into her sled and had him kind of cuddle up next to her inside of her fur coat. Kay was thinking, he's like, this really isn't helping me get warm, because he said he felt like he was hugging onto a snowdrift. And she's like, what? You're still cold? And so she gave him a little kiss on the forehead. But her kiss was cold as ice too. And that kiss went straight to his heart, which was a pretty bad thing because his heart was already, partially a block of ice. And he actually was so cold that he felt like he was dying, but only for a minute. And then he suddenly felt perfectly fine. He didn't feel cold at all anymore. And then the Snow Queen gave him another little kiss, and Kay forgot all about his friend Gerda, his grandmother, his parents, everyone back at home. And the Snow Queen was like, well, I mustn't kiss you anymore or I might kiss you to death. And Kay looked up at her, and he thought she was just so pretty. She didn't really seem to be made of ice now like she had when he saw her outside his window. In his eyes, she was like perfect, and he wasn't scared of her anymore. And he tried to impress her and told her that he's like, I can do arithmetic up till fractions, and I know the square footage and the population of our town. And she smiled at him, and then the sled took off again, and it went up into the air, and they were flying over the forest and lakes and the ocean and islands. Now back home, nobody knew what had happened to Kay, where he was. The other boys that had been in the square with him just told, everyone that this big sled showed up. He tied his little sled to the back of it, and it took him out of town. But nobody knew where he was. And Gerda was heartbroken about this, and she cried for a very long time. Now, after so long, everyone kind of just assumed that he fell into the river that ran along their town and had drowned. Then when spring came, Gerda was sitting outside in the sunshine, and she was thinking to herself that she just couldn't believe that Kay was gone, that he had died. And she felt like the warm sunshine on her skin was telling her that the sunshine didn't believe that Kay was dead and gone either. And then she told the swallows that Kay was dead and gone, but they said that they didn't believe that he was gone either. And so then Gerda started feeling like she didn't believe that he was dead and gone either. So the girl thought to herself, she's like, you know what, I'm gonna go down to the river myself and ask the river about Kay. So one early morning, she got up, she put on her new red shoes, kissed her grandmother, who was still sleeping, and snuck out of the house and went down to the river. So she asks the river, she's like, do you know what has happened to my playfellow? Did you take him? She's like, I'll give you my new red shoes if you'll give him back. And she takes off her shoes and she throws them into the river. But the shoes came back to her on like little wavelets, and Gerda was thinking, oh, well maybe they're giving the shoes, the river is giving the shoes back because it didn't take Kay. But then she thought, well, maybe I just didn't throw the shoes far enough out into the river. So she climbs into like a little rowboat that was on the shore next to her. She climbs, you know, to the end of it and tosses the shoes out into the river. But the boat somehow becomes loose and she starts floating away from the shore. Now little Gerda got frightened. She began to cry, but nobody could hear her except for some sparrows who started like flying alongside of her as if to say, don't worry, we're here. Now the boat started really quickly floating down river, and Gerda was crying in her stocking feet, and the banks of the river were beautiful with flowers, but there were no people to hear her crying. Then Gerda thought, well, maybe the river is taking me to see Kay. So she sailed down the river for hours, again in her stocking feet, and after a little while, she started floating by like an orchard of like cherry trees, and there was a cute little house within these trees. And outside of the house were two like wooden soldiers, and Gerda thought they were real, and she started shouting out to them, but they weren't. But an old woman came out of the house, having heard her, and she waded out to where the boat was and stopped it and grabbed little Gerda and put her onto dry land. And now Gerda was very happy to be out of the boat and on dry land again, but she was also a little frightened of this strange old lady. And the old lady was like, how did you get out here? And Gerda told her the whole story and asked her if she had seen Kay. But the woman told her that she had not seen Kay, but not to be sad, that she could come into her house and have some cherries, and she could see her flowers in her beautiful garden, that each one of them had a story to tell. Then the old woman took Gerda by the hand and took her into the house, and then locked the door behind them. That's suspicious. Now on the table were tons of cherries, and Gerda helped herself. While she was eating, the old woman combed her hair, and she said, I've always wanted a little girl like you. Now, as she was eating and getting her hair combed, Gerda forgot all about Kay, because the old woman, she knew magic. But she wasn't a bad witch. She just used her spells for amusement. Then the old woman left Gerda for a moment and went out into her garden and waved her hands over all the rose bushes. And they all sank down into the earth without leaving a trace behind. And the old woman wanted to make them disappear because she was afraid if Gerda saw them, she would be reminded of Kay and would want to run away. Then the old woman came back and got Gerda and took her into the flower garden. And there was every imaginable flower you could think of, much better than Gerda's picture books. Gerda jumped for joy and started playing in the garden until the sun went down. And then the old lady came and got her and put her to bed. Now the next day, she played in the garden again, and for many days after that. And she knew all the flowers by name, and she was always kind of thought or like had a hunch that there was some kind of a flower missing. Now one day, Gerda was sitting and watching the old woman work in her garden, and she had a sun hat on that had a bunch of like flowers on it. And the prettiest flower of all was a rose. The old lady had forgotten to take it off of her hat. Gerda realized that that was the kind of flower that was missing from the garden. She's like, there were no roses in the garden. So she sprang up and went out to the garden to look for roses, but found none. She began to cry about it, and her tears fell onto the earth right in the spot where the roses used to be. And her tears warmed and moistened the earth, and a bunch of roses sprang up in full bloom just as they had been before they sank down into the earth. Now Gerda was so happy when she saw these roses, and it made her think of the roses back home, which then made her think of Kay. And she's like, oh no, oh my gosh, she's like, I'm supposed to be looking for him. I forgot all about it. So then she asked the roses, she's like, do you know where Kay is? Is he dead and gone? And they're like, oh no, we've been underground where all the dead people are, and Kay was not among them. So Gerda's like, oh, thank goodness. And she started going around to all the other flowers and asking all of them if they had seen Kay. But each flower dreams its own dream and would tell Gerda many things, but nothing about Kay. So she gave up asking the flowers and just ran out of the garden in her bare feet. And she ran and ran, and she would look back occasionally to make sure there was nobody chasing her, coming after her, and nobody was. So finally, when she couldn't run anymore, she sat down on a rock to rest. And she's looking around, and she notices that it's not summer anymore, it's actually late autumn. But she hadn't known that, being in this, perfect sunshine garden where every flower of every kind was always in bloom. And Gerda is sitting there thinking to herself, she's like, oh my gosh, I've wasted all this time. She's like, I can't waste any more time. And she gets up and she moves on. And as she's walking along, she notices everything around her is cold and dreary. And everything looks very gray and sad. Now soon, Gerda had to rest again, and a crow comes up to her. And in English, it says, good day, little girl. What are you doing out here all alone? And she couldn't quite make out every word that he said, but she could make out the word alone. So she knew what it was asking her, and she told it her whole story and asked the crow if he had seen Kay. And the crow said, you know what, I believe I have, with the princess. And Gerda's like, princess? What princess? He lives with a princess? And the crow's like, yes, I believe so. And the crow was like, but it's so difficult to speak your language. He's like, do you speak crow? And Gerda's like, no. She's like, my grandmother did, but she never taught me. And so the crow's like, okay, well, I'll just do my best then. I forgot lashes. So, no lashes. Then the crow told her everything that he had heard. Now, all his information, all his gossip, he had gotten from his sweetheart, another crow that lives near the palace. And he had heard from her that the princess one day decided she wanted to get married. So she put a notice in the newspaper that any young man who was handsome enough could come to the palace to speak with the princess. And the one that was the most well-spoken, the best conversationalist, she would choose as her husband. But unfortunately, I guess nobody lived up to her standards and nobody was chosen. Even though when this announcement was put out, tons of men had run to the palace. Then the crow told her that as the men were all standing outside of the palace, a young man had come walking by. And Gerda's like, oh, that must be Kay. And the crow's like, I believe it is. He was like, I believe so because his eyes sparkled like yours do. Anyway, when he had seen all these men standing outside the palace and starting to go inside, this young man decided to go into the palace with them, even though he didn't know what was really going on. Now, inside the palace, he walked straight up to the princess and spoke very well. And he was the picture of good looks and gallantry. Now, he had not come there to woo the princess like everybody else. He simply wanted to hear her wisdom because he admired her. And she ended up admiring him back. And Gerda was like, oh, that is definitely Kay. Kay is very smart. He can even do arithmetic up to fractions. She's like, won't you please take me to the palace and get me inside? And the crow was like, okay, I'll see what I can do. Maybe my sweetheart can help us. But it's gonna be difficult getting you in there. And Gerda was like, no, no, no. As soon as Kay hears that I'm outside, he'll come and get us. And the crow was like, okay. He's like, wait here. And he flew off. I love when there's talking animals in stories. I believe they are supposed to represent different parts of our own psyche. And when he came back, it was dark, and he had a little bit of food for her, which he had gotten from his sweetheart, who had gotten it from the palace. And he's like, my sweetheart knows about a staircase in the back of the castle that she can get a key to. Now, when all the palace lights were out, they snuck up to the palace where the staircase was, and the door was ajar. And they go inside, and they meet up with the crow's sweetheart. And she's like, oh, little girl. She's like, I've heard all about you. You're such a little sweetie. She's like, come, follow me. Then they came to a very beautiful bedroom. And there was a bed that was all white, and that's where the princess was sleeping. And there was another bed that was all red, and that's where Kay was sleeping. And Gerda goes running to the side of the bed, and she shakes him awake. And when he turns to look at her, it's not Kay. It's some other handsome young man who was now the prince. Then the princess wakes up, and she's like, what's going on? And Gerda begins to cry, and she tells them her whole story and how the crows helped her get in there. And the prince and princess felt bad for Gerda. So the prince gets out of his bed and he's like, here, you sleep in my bed tonight. And so she climbs in, she falls asleep, and she begins to dream. And she dreamt that she saw angels, and they were pulling a little sled, and Kay was sitting on it. And he looked up and he smiled at her. But then Gerda woke up and she forgot the dream. So the next day, the prince and princess, they dressed Gerda all up in a beautiful little dress. And they actually asked her to stay with them, but she was like, I can't, I gotta find Kay. She did ask if she could get a pair of boots, because remember, she's barefooted, and a horse. And so they did. They got her a pair of boots and a beautiful little muff. Then they led her to the door and out of the castle, where there was a carriage waiting for that was made of pure gold, and it even had the prince and princess's coat of arms emblazed upon it. And it had a coachman and footman. So they help her into the carriage. They wish her good luck. They also send along some food with her. And Gerda says goodbye to them. She says goodbye to the crows. And then her carriage rides off into the sunshine. So they were riding through the woods. And the gold from the carriage was so blinding that it kept away any robbers. But finally, one band of robbers were able to seize the horses, and they killed the coachman and the footman, and they dragged little Gerda out of the carriage. And this old robber woman was like, oh, she's a fat, pretty one. I'm sure she'll taste very nice. And she drew out a sharp knife. Then the old woman's little daughter jumps on her back and bites her ear. And she's like, no, she's gonna be my little playmate. And she's gonna give me her muff and her pretty dress. Then the little robber girl, she grabs Gerda by the arm and they both climb up into the driver's seat of the carriage and they ride off further into the woods. Now the little robber girl, she was about the same age and size as Gerda, but she was much stronger. And the little robber girl, she puts her arm around Gerda and she's like, don't worry. She's like, they won't kill you as long as I don't get angry with you. And she looks Gerda up and down. She's like, you must be a princess. And Gerda's like, no. And she tells her her whole story, her adventure, and how she's looking for Kay. So finally, the carriage comes to a stop inside the courtyard of the robber's castle. And the walls are crumbling, and there's cracks everywhere. And there are crows flying all over the place. They go into a large hall where there is some food cooking. And the little robber girl's like, you're gonna sleep with me and all my little pets. So after they had something to eat, the little robber girl takes Gerda into a corner of the big hall where there's some straw and some like rugs laid out, kind of like this is her bedroom or something. And there's a bunch of pigeons that are roosting overhead, and the little robber girl's like, they're all mine, they're all my little pets. And she grabs one by the feet and she holds it up to Gerda's face and she's like, kiss it. Then she's like, and this is my sweet bee. And she grabs a reindeer by the horn and kind of like drags it over, but it's tied up by a rope around its neck. And the little robber's girl is like, oh, you know, we need to keep him tied up or he'd run away. She's like, every night I like to take my knife and tickle his neck with it so he won't ever run away. And she pulls out the knife and she holds it to the reindeer's neck. And then she starts laughing and she grabs Gerda and pulls her down into the bed with her. And Gerda's like, you sleep with a knife? And the little robber girl is like, oh yes, I always sleep with a knife. You never know what might happen. And she's like, tell me about your adventures again and about little Kay. So Gerda tells her whole story over again. And pretty soon the little robber girl, she's got her arm around Gerda's neck, holding her tight, kind of like a teddy bear or something. And in her other hand, she has her knife. So Gerda is telling her stories, and pretty soon the little robber girl is fast asleep snoring. Now Gerda naturally couldn't sleep, not knowing whether she was going to live or die. And pretty soon some pigeons came down from the rafters and they told her that they had seen Kay. They'd heard her story and told her like, hey, we've seen Kay. He was in the Snow Queen's sled. And Gerda's like, oh, she's like, where were they going? And the pigeons tell her that they were most likely going to Lampland because that is a place that's always covered in ice and snow. They're like, if you don't believe us, ask the reindeer. And the reindeer was like, oh yes, there's always snow and ice there. He's like, that's where the Snow Queen's summer house is. Her permanent castle is in the North Pole though, and somewhere on an island called Spitzenberg. And the little robber girl goes, stop moving or I'll put a knife in you. So she went to sleep. And in the morning, she told the little robber girl all about what the pigeons and the reindeer had told her. And the little robber girl looks at the reindeer and she's like, oh, she's like, is that true? Do you know where Lampland is? And the reindeer's like, oh yeah. He's like, I know better than most. I was born there. Then the little robber girl is like, well, you know, the menfolk are going to be away today. And my mother normally, you know, in the afternoon, she has a drink and then takes a nap. She's like, so maybe after she falls asleep, maybe we can see if we can get you out of here. So that's what happened. Her mother got drunk and fell asleep. And so the little rubber girl got the reindeer and told it to take Gerda to the Snow Queen's palace. She helps Gerda up onto the reindeer's back, and she's like, yeah, but I'm gonna keep your boots and your muff because they're too pretty. She's like, but here, you can have my mom's mittens. She also gave Gerda some food, and she told the reindeer to take care of her friend. And Gerda thanked her, and then the reindeer darted off, running as fast as he could, and then he saw the northern lights, and he was like, oh, there's the northern lights. That means we're getting close. And he ran as fast as he could, day and night, until they finally arrived in Lampland. Now within Lampland, there was an area called Finnmark. And in Finnmark, they came to a little house there, and they knocked on the door. And inside there was a thin woman, and she had them come inside, and she fed them. And they told her all about Gerda's story. Now when Gerda wasn't paying attention, the woman pulled the reindeer to the side, and she's like, you know, little Kay is with the Snow Queen, and he seems quite happy there. He really thinks it's like the best place in the world to be. And you're not going to change his mind until you get that piece of glass that's in his eye and in his heart out, or he won't leave. And the reindeer was like, well, can you give little Gerda something to make her stronger so she can defeat the Snow Queen? And the lady's like, well, I can't give her anything that's gonna make her more powerful than she already is. She's like, don't you see? I mean, look how far she came on bare feet. She's like, but we mustn't tell her that she's as powerful as she is because we need her to remain innocent. She's like, if she can reach the Snow Queen's palace, there isn't much else we can do for her anyway. She's like, her gardens start about, 2 miles from here. She tells the reindeer, she's like, take her there and then come right back to me. So the woman put Gerda on the reindeer's back, and it rushed off as fast as it could. But Gerda had forgotten her mittens, and the cold was just like cutting right through her. But the reindeer dare not stop, and when it got to the garden, it put Gerda down on the ground, gave her a kiss, and then ran off. Poor Gerda stood there with no shoes, no mittens, in the middle of freezing cold Finnmark. But she ran forward as quickly as she could, trying to ignore the cold. Snow was falling, and the wind was blowing so hard that the snowflakes were like falling sideways. And the snowflakes were becoming bigger and bigger, and they were growing into like a monstrous size. They seemed to even be like alive, and they were the Snow Queen's guards. Now Gerda was afraid, so she started saying the Lord's Prayer, and as she spoke, her breath would come out and freeze, and it would grow thicker and thicker, and then it began to form into angels, and they wore helmets and had spears and shields, and more of them were appearing, so that by the time she was done saying the Lord's Prayer, she was surrounded by a legion of angels. And the angels pierced the Snow Queen's guards with their spears, and this shattered them into pieces so that Gerda could continue to walk on fearlessly. And the angels touched her hands and her feet so that she couldn't feel the cold anymore, and she was able to quickly move on towards the Snow Queen's palace. Now meanwhile, Kay is inside the palace, completely unaware that Gerda is just outside. And in fact, he wasn't thinking about Gerda at all. Now the palace was made of snow and ice, and there were hundreds of rooms, and was lit up by the northern lights. And all the rooms were immensely big and empty, and the ice that formed them glittered. Now there was never any fun inside of this castle. No balls, no parties, no games, not even gossip over coffee. It was immense, vast, and cold, and in the midst of the castle was one very large room, and in the middle was a frozen lake, and it was broken up into thousands of pieces, and the Snow Queen, when she was home, would sit in the middle of it, and she called it sitting on the mirror of reason. Now Kay was there too on this vast lake that was broken up, and he was so cold that he was blue. But it didn't bother him because his heart was a complete lump of ice. And he was taking big pieces of ice and kind of dragging them along and trying to like arrange them into patterns, kind of like he was doing a puzzle. And the Snow Queen called these patterns of ice puzzles of reason. And in Kay's eyes, he thought these patterns that he was putting together were of most importance. And this was because of the grain of glass that was still in his eye. Now, he wasn't exactly sure why he was trying to put together these pieces of ice to form some sort of pattern. He felt like he was trying to form a word or something, but he didn't know which one. Now, he didn't know it, but the word was eternity. The Snow Queen had told him that if he could figure out this word and spell it out, this pattern, with the blocks of ice that he's dragging around, that he would become his own master, and that she would give him the entire world and a new pair of skates. So far, he hadn't figured it out. And then all of a sudden, she's like, you know what? She's like, I'm going to fly away to the warm countries and peek into the cauldrons. She was referring to the volcanoes Etna and Vesuvius, I believe. And she was like, I must whiten them a little, do them some good. We know that, very tall volcanoes do sometimes have snow on them. So she leaves, leaving Kay alone in this big empty hall trying to figure out his puzzle word thing. And he's sitting there and he's staring at his pieces of ice and he's thinking and he's thinking. And right then, Gerda comes walking in to this hall. And she sees Kay and she goes running over to him and she flings her arms around him. And she's like, Kay, I finally found you. But he just sits there rigid and cold. Now this made Gerda cry. She's got her arms around him and her face is kind of like on his chest, and her tears were hot and they fell onto his chest and they penetrated to his heart, and it thawed the lump of ice and the little bit of mirror that was stuck there. And he looks at her and she looks at him and she says, where the roses deck the flower veil, there, infant Jesus, thee we hail. Then Kay burst into tears and he cried so much that it washed out the little bit of glass that was still in his eye. And he shouts, he's like, Gerda, oh my gosh, it's been so long. And he's looking around and he's like, where am I? And they just held each other and cried for a few minutes. Now their happiness was so heavenly that the bits of ice that Kay had been arranging started to dance for joy. And when they settled back down, they settled into the pattern that created the word eternity. Just like the Snow Queen had told him, if he figured it out, that he would become his own master, gain the whole world, and get a new pair of skates. But they knew they had better get out of there soon because the Snow Queen could be coming back at any moment. So they held each other's hands and they walked out of the palace and they started heading back towards their home. They talked all about their grandmother and the roses back home. Now when they reached the end of the Snow Queen's gardens, the reindeer was there waiting for them with another reindeer. So they were able to ride the reindeers back to where the Finn woman lived, where they were able to get something to eat and able to get directions back home. So they rode the reindeers right up to the boundaries of their own country. And it was starting to warm up there, and they were seeing signs of spring, which meant that, you know, the reindeers couldn't go along. They like colder weather. So that's where they parted ways. Then they came across a young woman in a golden carriage, and it was the little robber girl. She had gotten tired of her family's ways and was riding north to see if maybe she would like it there better. So they say goodbye to her. Kay and Gerda continue on their way home, and eventually they recognize their town they lived in, and they go straight to their grandmother's home. They go inside, they go up the stairs to their grandmother's bedroom, and everything was just as they had left it. And as they walk through the door into the grandmother's bedroom, they look and they realize they're all grown up. And they sit down, still holding hands, and the grandmother was sitting there, and she was reading from her Bible out loud, and she read, "Without ye become as little children, ye cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven." And Kay and Gerda looked at each other, and they suddenly felt like they understood the meaning of that old hymn that Gerda used to always sing. "Where roses deck the flowery vale, there, infant Jesus, thee we hail." They both sat there, grown up, yet still like little children. And it was summer, and it was beautiful. The end. So that was a beautiful little story. I think the lesson is not to let age make you bitter, to kind of always keep that childlike heart condition, to be curious like a child. And, you know, you have to grow up, I guess, at some point, which is a good thing. You should grow up. Just don't forget what it was like to be a child, which is one of the reasons I love fairy tales so much. It keeps me young. I thought this was adorable. I do not understand how this was turned into Frozen by Disney. I do not see any type of similarity besides like a little bit about the part where, you know, Gerda was hugging Kay and her tears like warmed him back up. It's kind of like the same scene at the end of Frozen where Anna turns into ice, and yeah, I know, Frozen is not my favorite Disney movie of all time. In fact, Frozen is like kind of the cut-off point for me with the Disney movies. I pretty much like everything up until that point, and then Frozen and on, I'm just like, eh. Anyway, but thank goodness we have the original stories we can still read. If you're interested in reading this for yourself, I suggest that you do. My summaries do these stories no justice, so please actually get the book. I will link it in the description, the Amazon link. It's not an affiliate link, I just put it there for your convenience. If there are any stories that you would like me to cover on this channel, let me know in the comments. I'm pretty much open to any type of book. It doesn't have to be a fairy tale. It can be any kind of book for the most part. And remember, don't let age make you bitter. And I will see you in the next one. Bye. And the crow was like, and the crow was like, and the crow was like, oh my God. You stay with Daddy. Go sit with Daddy. No, baby, no. I know. I'm about halfway done. She dreamt this,